Hello and welcome to the Chapter 2 recap in preparation for the exam. This is Professor Herman in Business 1950. In this presentation, I'm going to cover a little bit more about team communication, although I said a lot about team communication in my previous lecture. It's a subject of importance on the exam. Collaborative writing as well, just some good advice here, as well as a couple things that will also be on the exam. Intercultural communication and diversity and inclusion, I went into a lot of depth on these, but there's a little bit more in the book, and I think I can also help you better prep for the exam by covering some of these as well. First, I want to talk about team communication. When we look at the variables of group communication that the book outlines, I really like these a lot, actually. I can and I need you to read them, but let's recap them. First, conflict. It's greatly misunderstood and often avoided. Conflict aversion can be a real problem at the office, actually. Which is not to say one should go about picking fights, but if there's a legitimate disagreement that has to be discussed, then it has to be discussed, and one should confront it simply, professionally, and with as few ruffled feathers as possible. Conflict should focus on issues, not personalities. So this section of this report doesn't do what we need it to do, is a great set of feedback to give, whereas I can't believe that you would turn something in like this. You're unreliable and you've really let me down. That obviously is a terrible way to go into an office conflict. Conformity is another variable. It means agreement to ideas, rules, or principles. Conformity is often good, but it can result in groupthink, where people think too similarly. I've seen a number of ideas get pushed through just because nobody pushed back against them, and they were actually not that good of ideas. And if folks had said, hey, wait, I'm not saying necessarily I disagree, but let me at least play devil's advocate with it, and it sparked a bit of a further discussion about that idea, maybe a bad idea could have been avoided. Finally is consensus, which represents group support for a decision even if some members have reservations. That is an ideal in group outcomes, as long as the ideas have truly been vetted and we didn't just get it coming out of groupthink. But at the same time, keep in mind that it's not required for every decision. It's only required for important ones. And even if it is an important one, if there's one person who's just intransigent, who just holds out, who dies on, where there's no hill of conflict on which he or she will not die, you need to keep in mind that sometimes the group just has to move forward. So how can conflict be constructive? We have some people here in this frankly stock image who were just shown around the table having a meeting, and they look perfectly civil, but they actually could be having some constructive conflict here. I think this section should go this direction. Well, actually, I think this section should go this direction. Oh, really? Why do you think that? Could you elaborate? And then after they share it, go back and say, oh, I like why you think it should do that, but even considering that, I actually think it should still head in this original direction, and here's why I think that. And that kind of respectful constructive conflict, being able to have that at the office is really productive. And it makes us more aware of problems. It encourages change. No group is ever perfect, no office is ever perfect, no company is ever perfect, and so some willingness to engage in a bit of conflict to strive for better is important. It makes life more interesting, as the book highlights. That can be a good thing. That can also be a bad thing if you're just stirring up conflict for the sake of killing boredom at the office. But it is certainly going to keep your work life more interesting if productive conflict is a norm, is an expectation, and you know that you have to be on your toes at all times because, respectfully, other colleagues may push back on you, and they know the same because they know that you can respectfully and will respectfully push back on them. Then work is actually more engaging, and that increases employee satisfaction and makes for a better time at work. It also increases the quality of decision making for all the reasons we talked about above. And finally, it helps us understand ourselves better. This is maybe not the most important work-specific goal, but I think it's something we should all strive for. And then when we do better understand ourselves, then we actually can also bring better selves to the workplace. Finally, it increases our self-confidence. Being able to give constructive feedback and then hear constructive feedback and have that conflict not be the end of your ability to focus or have a good work day. After you go through a few rounds of that, you'll really feel like, oh, I'm really a pretty seasoned professional. And so that's the kind of outcome you're looking for. A question that you just may want to think about in your idle time, sort of as you're showering or driving or whatever, is when have you experienced constructive conflict on a team and how is it resolved? How is it resolved? When it comes to laying the groundwork early with teams in a way that sets you up for success, here are some important tips. Be ready to answer which decisions will be most important to our team. How should we make those decisions? What if two team members are having a conflict? How should it be resolved? What if someone needs help completing a task? How should they handle this? And what if someone misses a deliverable or a team meeting? How should they notify the team? What will be the consequences? If you answer these questions up front and set those expectations for your team, then you're definitely setting yourselves up for greater success in the future. The book, as I said earlier in a previous lecture, is great about how to give feedback, and I just want to make this all super explicit. Be descriptive, avoid labels, don't exaggerate, speak for yourself, use I statements, and here's an example, a couple of really effective examples of how to use I statements combined with some principles of how to do so. First, start when you. Describe the behavior without judgment or exaggeration. State the facts specifically. When you X, Y, Z, and just be very specific about what that means. I feel, and you talk about how the behavior affects you. And finally say, because I, and describe why you were affected and connect those facts with your feelings. Oh, here's the first one, which is a great example.
When you talk about people who aren't here, I feel embarrassed for them, and I don't know what to say. It makes me uncomfortable to talk about people who can't defend themselves.
That's like a really thoughtful response, right? And it would be hard to push back on that because the person owns it as their feelings, but is very specific and non-personal and non-judgmental in terms of connecting that to the object of the feedback's behavior. And here's the second one.
When we spend 10 minutes talking about the weekend, I have a good time, but I get frustrated because we have so much work to do and I have to leave by 4 p.m.
So the more you can give feedback like that when you're being critical about identifying problems on a team or with a person, then the more helpful and constructive you're being, and the more likely you are to get good results with this constructive criticism. Next, let's talk about collaborative writing. I've got a couple slides worth of suggestions here. Identify project requirements. This includes determining the project goals, identifying project components, and deciding how you'll share information. As well as create a project plan. This means divide work fairly, create a project plan, and finally draft the writing. Start with an outline. It's always really important to start with an outline. I really strongly recommend having a legal pad or printer paper or some other physical note, pen and paper based outline to the side so that you always have a visual tether to what it is that you're writing next to your keyboard and your monitor so that you don't get lost in the word processing software. Agree on a writing style. That's pretty important. Share information with your team. That's also really valuable. Again, I've got a lot of recommendations here, largely read out of the book. Revise the writing. Make sure you allow enough time for editing the draft and provide feedback. Make sure you have a single voice in the project. You know, if you've got somebody writes section 1, somebody else writes section 2, somebody else writes section 3, you're going to want everyone to try to come together so that it sounds like one person wrote it rather than it sounding like a bunch of different people wrote it. Have each team member review the entire draft because your names are all going on it, so you want to make sure everyone agrees with everything. Then finalize the project. Have everyone proofread the final document. More eyes, the more errors you'll catch. And be very clear about the delivery, how you're going to hand it off. Now, when you're giving comments on peers' writing, there are some important suggestions for how to do so. Read first for meaning. Don't jump right into criticizing. Just say, at first, what is being communicated here? Assume the role of reader, not instructor. Point out sections that you liked and those you disliked. Remember, positive feedback is also important, not just negative feedback. Use I language, like we talked about a little bit ago. Not, you need to make this clearer, but I was confused here. Comment helpfully, but sparingly. And emphasize the writer when giving positive feedback and the text when giving negative feedback. Finally, avoid taking over the text. You can't fix everything or change everything. You have to let some of the original author's voice and ideas and language stand. One thing the book suggests is wikis because it helps work in teams. Now, they mean teams generally, but I just want to point out that there is a wiki function in Microsoft Teams, and we'll talk about that in a second. It improves work process. We get to better collaboration because you're just seeing immediate feedback, paragraph by paragraph, live within the document. You get more contributions that way, especially if you take time to track who's giving which feedback or which contributions, and then give positive, constructive reinforcement for that behavior. We get better work outcomes, improved knowledge management, less email, fewer meetings. In short, it's wins all around. And like I said, there is a wiki function within Microsoft Teams, and it actually works reasonably well. I haven't gotten into a lot of group writing assignments within Microsoft Teams. This is a relatively recent software adoption in my workflow, but it's I played around with it just a little bit with an article that I'm working on here, and it seems to work reasonably well. Now, if you can't find the wiki function within Microsoft Teams, it might be on the left side, but if it's not, just click the 3 dots at the very bottom, and then it should be among your apps there. Now, you can either search for it, or it might be under your recent apps, or it might just be suggested there. And if not, just search for it or click on More Apps. Now, it's not strictly a wiki, but something that is that is good enough and wiki-like enough is simply Google Docs. And most of you will have a lot more familiarity with this. And if you're in a writing environment where security to a specific Microsoft account or other platform account is not required, and you can pick your platform, maybe you just pick Google Docs because it's something that everyone knows a little better. I do find it a little more intuitive and a little more useful for writing than the Teams wiki, and trying to collectively write in Microsoft Word online or anything like that is just not fun. So I would not especially recommend that if you can get around it. A few more words about intercultural communication. Now, we did talk about this in a lot of depth in a previous lecture, but I want to cover a bit more. First, when we think about understanding cultural values, the book actually lays out even more variables than I did in the Geert Hofstede piece that I laid out. So I'm just going to put those all here just so none of them surprise you. And they're all certainly worth thinking about. Individualism, we talked about this a little bit. Time orientation. Some cultures are pretty comfortable with meetings generally starting maybe a little early, maybe a little late. It's not especially important in some cultures. Absolutely, 3 o'clock means 3 o'clock period. In some cultures, 3 o'clock means 2:45 or sooner period. So understanding that is important. Power distance, I talked about in a lot of depth. Uncertainty avoidance as well. Formality is an important one. You're going to want to make sure you understand how formal a culture is before you proceed. Materialism. How materialistic is a culture? That's really important. Finally, context sensitivity. How much context versus how much is it reading subtle contextual cues versus being very explicit with your explicit language? That's an especially important variable that's hard for U.S. Americans in particular because we are a very low context sensitivity culture. We just come out and say stuff. And so when we deal with cultures such as those in Southeast Asia where context sensitivity is really important, we can really struggle a lot. The book talks about personal spaces for social interaction. I think this is just important to keep in mind. If you're within a foot and a half of somebody, there better be a pretty good reason for that, and that's why it's called the intimate distance. Casual, within 4 feet. If you're pretty comfortable with someone and they're pretty comfortable with you, it's a colleague or something, and you're leaning in a little bit to say something that's maybe not exactly something you'd shout from the rooftops. Maybe within 4 feet is pretty good. Within 12 feet is a pretty comfortable social distance. Now, keep in mind, though, these distances are also vary a lot by culture. So I had a grad school colleague who was from Poland, and her understanding of casual distance was right about the barrier of what we'd say between intimate and casual. So she was always about 18 inches from me, and until I got used to it, it was kind of a little unsettling. Like, Magdalena, why are you so close to me all the time? And then I just realized that's just how she is, and that's just how she maybe how she grew up. I don't know a lot about specifically whether that's a norm within Polish culture or just her, but we have a very flexible expectation here as you go from culture to culture to culture. So the more flexible you are, the more you can deal with this variety. Communicating across cultures is a really important thing to get good at more and more every year as we become an increasingly multinational, multicultural business environment. But there are a few rules that work kind of across the board. First, maintain formality, Mr., Ms., Doctor, Professor, until somebody invites you to use a first name, for instance, handshake and or bow. Dress formally, dress better than you think you have to if you're not sure. Show respect. Communicate clearly. Use very specific, clear language rather than metaphors or culturally specific, grounded ideas. Make sure that you don't have ways that are potentially confusing to people who aren't from your culture. Diversity and inclusion is an important topic, as I think I highlighted by dedicating an entire lecture to it. But there are a few more points that the book makes, and then one additional point that I would just like to make before we wrap up this lecture here. First, the book talks about common gender communication patterns, and I would add that these are not universal, but these are relatively common. Women tend to communicate more in some ways and less in others, and men tend to communicate more in some ways and less than others. Now, obviously, as gender is becoming less rigid over time, and as people are now hopefully comfortable in your place of business being ambiguously gendered, not clearly identifying with the female or male, or the women or men gender, then hopefully you're seeing these as not essential. But the book does assume that you know some of these as we go into the exam, and so I just wanted to make sure that we covered that, because these patterns do still have some real validity, and so I think it's important to not confuse your preferred way of communicating with the right or the best way of communicating here. Women are more likely to communicate to build rapport/connections, and men are more likely to communicate to preserve independence and status. Women to interrupt to agree or support another person, whereas men are more willing to interrupt to share their own ideas or to change a subject. Women are more likely to talk out solutions with another person, whereas men are more likely to be directive in their conversation. We need to do X, Y, Z. Women are more likely to emphasize politeness, whereas men are more likely to dominate discussions. That's not to say that all men do that, but it is more common for men to do that. Women are less likely to call attention to their own work, whereas men are more comfortable doing that on average. Women tend to externalize success and internalize failures, and the reverse tends to be true for men. And women tend to speak differently to other women than they do to men, and vice versa. Again, these are merely tendencies, these are not universals, and B, these obviously are less a norm or expectation that we can hold over time as genders tend to become less defined in our country and as folks tend to become more comfortable being identified as a member of neither gender. Which brings us to a really cool development that happened out of Merriam-Webster last year. Their word of the year was they. And they said our word of the year for 2019 is they. It reflects a surprising fact. Even a basic term, a personal pronoun, can rise to the top of our data. Although our lookups are often driven by events in the news, the dictionary is also a primary resource for information about language itself, and the shifting use of they has been the subject of increasing study and commentary in recent years. Lookups went up 313% in 2019 over the previous year. This signals that even the definitive sticklers for proper usage of words have now said that it's okay to use they to refer to just one person. This is great, not only because it makes writing easier, but it also creates greater inclusivity. We don't have to alternate gender pronouns or write around them, but we can also write in such a way that we automatically include people who don't identify with either gender. And I think that's a pretty important contribution to diversity and inclusion.